Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on living with both my power and my love. This topic I have found very fascinating, given it quite a bit of thought, because I've seen on so many occasions that people sacrifice one or the other, their power, their personal efficacy, their ability to run their lives for their love, or they do it the other way around. They sacrifice their love for their power. And if we look at the world's political situation, we certainly can see that many world leaders particularly seem to be very much into their power, not so much into their love. And so they tend to push and shove their way around. I was reminded just recently that indeed many people do this just in ordinary relationships, and it seems to be at least somewhat related to gender identity. That produced some laughs. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. The men tend to be into their power, particularly in situations where they need to feel, or they want to feel, that they are in control of a situation, or they're just plain showing off. And women tend to defer, particularly to men, but even to other women, and tend to be very gracious and just, oh yes, and whatever the other person seems to want or need, they give them that. And if it's their own power, then they if it's the other person's power, they tend to give that to them. They don't try to compete with them. Whereas men tend to be very competitive and speak with great authority. I remember years ago pointing out to some woman who was having some serious difficulties in her relationships with men that men, do tend to assert themselves and to speak with great authority on subjects that they may or may not actually know anything about. And they're very good at covering up the fact that they do not actually know what they're talking about. And women, and this particular woman, tended to believe what men said about themselves and about the world, and tended to see men as being in control of things, very much in control of their lives, and being able to navigate and conduct themselves through life situations that the woman was, in this case, being very passive about, and very much needing and being dependent upon a man to tell her what to do. And so we spent some time trying to help her come to understand her own power and how she had been trained to give up her power for what she hoped would be love in return. And it's this negotiation that seems to take place so very often in relationships, where different people, one person or the other, and it can go back and forth in couples. Sometimes they trade off, where they have certain areas where the guy is the authority, and certain areas where the woman is the authority. And sometimes the situation is that is not to be challenged in any way. If the woman is the lord of, we'll just say, domestic things for the sake of the conversation here, then the husband, or, well, yeah, we'll say a husband here, a spouse, or the partner in the relationship, lets the woman have complete say in that area, never challenges her in any way. And then in matters perhaps of finance, the man may be the person who handles the money in a household. And I remember decades ago seeing people, experts in the field of relationships, talk about how women shouldn't really handle the finances because it was very stressful. It's stressful for the guys too, but the idea was that the guys would handle it because they were tough, and the women shouldn't have to endure the stress of trying to balance the books and make sure all the bills were paid and take care of all the details of life that revolve around the checkbook. And I'm not saying, of course, that that's the way it should be. It's just this was advice that was being given, and many people, were following that kind of advice. where they were placing themselves in situations where they would surrender either their power or their love. And where surrendering the love, again, is a situation where one asserts oneself, takes control of a situation, or at least tries to take control of a situation, believes that one is responsible for those situations, and does not relate to a spouse or partner, or if it's in a corporation, relate to others necessarily with the kind of compassion and consideration and empathy that they would if they were in a situation where they were expressing more of their love, as, for instance, in the family. In modern day life, we're hearing a great deal about the authoritarian father figure, the head of the household, the person who's in charge and running the show in the home. We're hearing about discipline and, creating order in the household. And if they're teenagers are having problems, it's because they weren't properly parented. It's the parents' fault. That kind of thinking has reemerged, as many of you know, in recent months, and I guess over the last couple of years, and has gained a certain popularity again. And part of that thinking, of course, is that there's absolute loyalty to the leader and to the family and to the group. And anyone who does not follow that is, subject to ostracism or worse. You remember the old joke, well, let's ostracize George. I'll hold him and you do it. Right? George is going, what? You're right. The joke was, of course, that nobody knew what the word ostracism meant. But it just means to push out, to exclude, and perhaps to ridicule or otherwise, demean a person. So anyway, aside from the joke, the challenges that people face as they try to navigate relationships, which is a constant thing, unless you're living as an absolute hermit, you have to negotiate your relationships. And of course, there are those who advocate that you do that with love and compassion and kindness and generosity. And when you do that, you often have to serve others, but your own needs may or may not get met. And you may not feel that you are in a position to assert your needs, or at least to put forth that you have needs and that you would like to have those needs met, and to change your relationships if necessary so that you can find situations and relationships in which your needs are actually met. And of course, part of that process is knowing what you need. And that's not something that people in our society seem to be particularly good at. We often know what we want, but we don't really think about it in terms of what is it that we need? What are we really trying to get when we engage in certain behaviors or make certain requests? And so we wind up asking for things or putting ourselves in situations where we bring up things, that things come to us that don't actually meet our needs. I was at this point brought home to me years ago when listening to a lecture by Marshall Rosenberg, who founded the process known as nonviolent communication. And what Marshall Rosenberg said is that many times what we see are tragic expressions of unmet needs. Tragic expressions of unmet needs. I love that expression because if you think about it, what it means is that most people who are engaging in behavior that is not a lot of fun to be around are trying to meet some need and not doing a very good job of it. And usually part of the problem, as I was saying, is they don't know what their needs are. They don't really know what they need. And so they come up with desires, things that they think they want, which often are not really going to satisfy them. They don't have effective strategies to meet their needs because they don't know what their needs are. Now, some people know what their needs are and they still don't have effective strategies to meet them. So developing effective strategies is the other part of that equation. It's one thing to know what you need. It's another thing to know how to meet that need, and what you might do or not do that would help you fulfill your needs. There's a list available of universal human needs. And of course, it starts out with basic physiological ones like shelter, food, water. Um, Usually, clothing is included in that as part of shelter. Um, Safety and protection are other things that are very fundamental. And then we get into the more of the emotional needs, the need to have love and to have physical contact with people. Um, the lack of physical contact is something that's very much a part of our human society now. Um, I think we hug more than we did 50 years ago. I think that's true. But generally speaking, we don't have a lot of physical contact in our life. If you look at indigenous peoples, they tend to have a lot of physical contact. I remember reading about a tribe in Southeast Asia that lived very isolated from the outside world. And an anthropologist went to visit a village, was able to get an invitation to come in. And one of the things he discovered is the village was arranged roughly in a circle with huts. And while people had individual huts, or families would have huts, when it came time to go to sleep, the boundaries were very loose, and people would often sleep in each other's huts. And when they did so, they were usually in some physical contact, a hand or a foot, typically, or they might be lying just right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. But the idea was that the community was like one organism and with many cells. And those cells had to be bound together, had to be joined together, had to be connected. And so when they went to sleep, sometimes, somebody would, well, apparently fairly often, people would just pick a hut and go sleep in it. And it didn't matter whose hut it was. The other thing about that community was that there was no sense of possession. People had possessions, but they didn't have ownership of possessions. So if somebody else wanted something that you had for whatever reason, just they felt like, oh, it's just something nice and attractive, they would just, you were, by culture, you would offer it to them. You would give it to them. I remember a wonderful story about an indigenous person in Australia who became quite famous as an actor, appeared in a number of movies when indigenous people began to appear in movies. And he was explaining in an interview that I heard that any property that anyone had in his group, his tribe, was common property in the sense that, while you might have something like, oh, maybe you had a wristwatch that you had acquired through some trading with the outside world. And if somebody saw that and really thought that was, a wonderful thing, you were by cultural rules, you were obligated to give them that, to share that with them. So it was just the way the society conducted itself. So it's not a rare thing, the notion that we share what we have, and we don't really stand up for our own needs. We meet other people's needs, and in many cultures, the love factor, which I can call it that, the idea that you have compassion and generosity with members of your group. That's the predominant thing. And the idea of actually advocating for yourself, standing up and being a powerful person in the sense that we think of it here in Western culture, that would be regarded as very improper behavior. And you would undoubtedly hear about that in a very polite way, actually, in those cultures, as I understand it. Probably people wouldn't say anything to you directly unless it really got out of hand. But they would just suggest things and maybe help you a little bit to feel more comfortable. Because they, first of all, they would be recognizing that if you were acting like that, something was lacking in your life, something was missing, or that you had some need that was not being fulfilled. And so they would try to help you fulfill that need by offering you various things or doing things for you or just being with you. And in many cultures, I know the remedy for self centered behavior and asserting one's personal power is simply that the tribe comes and sits with you, or at least some members of the tribe would come and sit with you and just spend time with you. And it wasn't that they'd say anything to you, they wouldn't scold you or anything. They would just be with you because obviously there was something lacking and you needed attention. And when we work in some of the methods that I use, one of them being focusing, interrelationship focusing, that's what fundamentally what we do with the parts that are inside of us, the parts of us, the felt senses that we have of parts of us that are wanting or needing something. And the fundamental way we approach that is simply to sit with those parts. We just put our attention on them. And simply by holding attention on them in an innocent way, without any judgment, without trying to change them, which is tremendously important, we don't judge and we don't try to produce any specific change. We just sit with them. And then the energy shifts within us. And the problem or the need just disappears. And if there is a need that really does need to be met, then that becomes clearer and expressed in a much more efficacious way rather than as a tragic expression that involves often hurting oneself or other people. And so having this kind of approach, having this kind of viewpoint makes working with problems that people claim they have, things they identify as something that they would like to see change, it makes it very, very easy. So on the one hand, we have power and we see how that plays out in the world, particularly in our Western society, and I think very much in our country today. The authoritarian father figure is now the standard once again. It used to be absolute standard. And then the idea of individuality came along and people doing what they wanted to do became very much a part of our culture. And, many of us today absolutely value individuality, and we're not as strongly committed to a group, to identifying with a group, unless there's a crisis. And when there's a crisis, and it was pointed out, I remember some years ago, for instance, after the September 11th attack in 2001 on New York City, or in New York City and Washington, D.C., the country seemed to rally quite a bit, and we didn't really know who our enemy was, but we knew that we'd been attacked. And there was a great public collective consciousness shift to defending the country and making all of us safe. And we felt much more together, at least for a brief period of time, than we had been feeling. And certainly than we feel today, where our country seems to be very polarized over quite a number of issues. And so people are feeling very strongly about issues, but those issues reflect certain needs that people have within them. And so those needs are obviously not being met, or at least they're trying very hard to meet some needs that apparently aren't being met because of the intensity with which people are seeking changes or seeking particular rules for society, how society should be. And some would say even our very democracy is threatened because the model of democracy is equated to some degree with liberty and individuality. And in a time when rallying under a strong leader is the norm, then that even democracy itself gets challenged because what it stands for does not seem to be in harmony with the authoritarian father figure style of leadership that we're experiencing right now. I want to shift the topic just a little bit for a moment. When I wrote this out, um, I wrote living both your power and your love. And when I wrote that out and thought about it for a few minutes, I realized what I was saying is I was speaking to you, to someone else, to any other person who happened to join the webinar or listens in to this on YouTube. And I played with the idea of saying living with both my power, or living both my power and my love. And I felt a great strength in that. And I started in last month's webinar actually doing the speaking in the first person when I got down to the actual experiences that we were discussing. And today I'm going to do the same thing. I will say it in the first person, but I want you to hear it in your own first person. That is, I'm not speaking of myself. I may be speaking of myself, but I want you to try to say it in your head or hear it in your head as yourself speaking to yourself. My power, my love. And begin to see how those two things may or may not be in conflict. Up till now, I've been discussing how those things tend to be in conflict because we tend to see that we either are going to be powerful or we're going to love, and we see love as giving and power as, in some sense, taking, or at least having a position of influence over others. And control gets to be a very big factor when we're talking about power. And so when we talk about love, we often feel that we're not in control of our life, we're serving others. And when we talk about power, we feel that we are in control of our life and not necessarily serving others. And so when we evaluate, for instance, our politicians, we tend to want politicians that we feel are going to be listening to us and caring about us on a very personal level, because the issues that we bring to them are things that really matter to us. What we seem to get, on the other hand, are people who are very powerful and who look at our appeals to them as something that they have to evaluate and judge and see what will work and what won't work, and where the word that keeps coming up is stakeholders, those that have an influence or a significant investment or position in a particular issue. And of course, what that happens then is that those with the largest stake, they're the ones who get the greatest consideration. And what we wind up with then is what we call a corporate structure, where the corporations have the power and the people seem to have very little power, and the people don't get the laws passed that they want, and the corporations do. And that has a lot to do, of course, then with money, and the Supreme Court decision that money is speech, and that corporations enjoy the same rights as people, which reminds us of 1984, but I'm not going to go further with that at this point. So anyway, that's our basic position on that. Let me talk then about the solution, and then we'll have our group clearing session. How do we resolve what is an apparent conflict between self-efficacy, power, personal power, and love, which is connecting with people, compassion, and sharing and giving? On the surface, these two things really don't look very compatible. But if we think about it, there can be power in love, and indeed whole movements have been built on love for the purpose of achieving social change and a great deal of power. And part of the nonviolent movement, nonviolent direct action it's sometimes called, part of the wonder of it is that it is based on love. It's not based on dominating or controlling others. It's not based on competing for resources or competing for attention. It's based on love and on bringing one's needs to attention in a very gentle, sometimes very public, but very gentle way. And the peace movement and the civil rights movement were that we enjoyed. Goodness, it was about a half a century ago. Um, those things were very much based on love. Those were not movements that were based on particularly physical power. And in fact, they were confronting those who had a great deal of power, physical power, and economic and social power, um, and were in support of those who did not have those things. And they worked very, very well. It's easy to see, I think, that it's possible to have power in love if one knows what one wants, what one values, what one stands for, and particularly what one needs. And you can get your needs met um, and stand up for yourself in a powerful way, even if it's based on love and on bringing to society a greater collaboration and a greater sense of oneness. It's a little harder, I think, to see the love in power, in the exercise of power. It has been done, but more often we see it in a corrupted form where it's selfish and self-centered, and is basically based on greed. But there have been those leaders in the world, and not necessarily just in nations, but even in corporations and such, where the well-being of the employees, the well-being of the people of the land, are very much in the forefront. That has a lot to do on this, and this is just on the practical level of what it is that we value. In our society today, we tend to value profit and productivity. And so we measure things in crude economic terms of how much wealth is created, rather than in the terms of what human needs are being met. What is our unemployment rate? What is our homeless rate? What is our poverty rate? And then the positive aspects of that, of course, are are people living well in society. And in Europe, in America, we tend to fear the word socialist, but most European countries today are what we would call what we in this country would call socialist. The state provides many services, and they're paid for generally by high taxes, but the quality of life is very, very high. And if you've been to Europe, particularly Northern Europe and the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, um, the quality of life is extremely high. I remember, oh goodness, it was so long ago, that I was in Copenhagen, and I was just wandering around and happened into a neighborhood that was not so well-to-do, shall we say. And somebody saw me and warned me that I really shouldn't be in this neighborhood. It was not it was not such a safe neighborhood. And I looked around at the neighborhood and I said, you don't know what an unsafe neighborhood looks like. I live in an unsafe neighborhood in the United States. This is relatively safe. I said, no place is completely safe, but this is relatively safe compared to where I live. I was in Philadelphia at the time, and in West Philadelphia, actually. And it was not a particularly safe place to be. So quality of life in Scandinavia is extremely high, and people pay for it. But everybody lives well. Everybody who works full time has a livable income, and they don't have to be on welfare. So there are those people in this country today that are advocating raising the minimum wage, where there are others who are advocating cutting taxes, particularly taxes on those who generate a lot of income. That is, people who are wealthy and corporations. And so that's what we're seeing both on the federal level and on the states level, are massive cuts in taxes, and then a cutback in services for those who are not doing well. And there's this feeling that those who are not doing well, it's their fault. They're blamed for it. If they were to work harder or try harder, they could make more money and they would be okay. And then there are those who say that's a ridiculous point of view. It's absolutely untrue. Most of those people are working one or even two full-time jobs, or working multiple jobs to add up to more than a full-time, more than 40 hours a week, and they still can't get by. And they're still often they qualify for public assistance in one form or another. And then there are those who say, well, we got to cut public assistance because we don't have the money because we cut the taxes. And so this kind of weird situation has evolved, but it's based on differing values and differing viewpoints and a non-agreement on what the facts of a situation are. So power can be generous or it can be selfish. And in our experience, generally it tends to be selfish, but it can be powerful. So that's on the more relative level. Ultimately, the resolution of the difference between power and love is on the subtlest level of existence, where the two really merge as one, where they are the impulse of nature's intelligence, of nature's design for us, that we should be able to live as complete people and love as full people, as fully developed people. And so when we do the work that I do on the energy level, we're working on that very subtlest level where we can bring the two things together and allow a person who is not experiencing love in their power to have that experience, or a person who is not experiencing power in their loving to have that experience. So they feel the power of love, and they feel the love and the power, the generosity, the caring, setting a standard that my power should bring about well-being for myself and everyone else. So there's a level of benevolence on both sides that's beautiful. So it's all in the oneness, in the unity of bringing together our power and our love. So with that, I'll just see if there's any questions in the group here. And if not, then we will draw this presentation to a conclusion.